Hello there and welcome to History for Lunatics. I am very glad you're here tonight. Find somewhere comfortable, let the room settle around you, and give yourself a little distance from the noise of the day, because tonight we're going back to a New York that was loud, exhausted, financially wounded, and about to discover that one unknown man could change the behaviour of an entire city. This is not a story that begins with the name David Berkowitz. New Yorkers did not know that name when the first gunshots were fired. They did not know the phrase "son of Sam." They did not know that a postal worker living in a modest apartment in Yonkers would soon become one of the most feared criminals in the country. At first, there was only a parked car, two young women, a stranger approaching through the darkness, and several shots that seemed to have no explanation. Before we step into that night, let me ask you something. What time is it where you're listening? Is it late enough that the street outside has gone quiet? Are there still cars passing your window? Or has your neighbourhood reached that strange hour when every unexpected sound feels slightly louder than it should? You can tell me where you are listening from in the comments. I genuinely enjoy seeing how far these stories travel and imagining all the different rooms in which history is being heard. And if this kind of storytelling speaks to you, if you enjoy looking beyond the famous headline and into the ordinary lives caught beneath it, you can subscribe and give the video a like. There is no need to interrupt what you're doing. Do it whenever the moment feels right. Now let's go back to the Bronx on a hot summer night in 1976, when New York was still trying to convince itself that it understood danger. The city already had plenty of reasons to feel uneasy. New York had come close to financial collapse the previous year. Municipal services had been cut, public employees had been laid off, and entire neighbourhoods felt neglected by institutions that no longer seemed capable of keeping up. Buildings stood abandoned, subway cars were covered in graffiti, newspapers carried stories about crime, political arguments, strikes, budget reductions, and a city government struggling to pay for the basic machinery of urban life. None of this meant that ordinary New Yorkers spent every hour terrified. People still went to work, visited relatives, crowded into restaurants, complained about the heat, attended baseball games, and stayed out late. New York remained New York. It was energetic, impatient, funny, difficult, and deeply alive. But beneath that life was a growing belief that things were no longer being held together as securely as they once had been. That feeling matters because fear rarely arrives in an empty room. It enters a place where other worries are already waiting. In the summer of 1976, New Yorkers worried about rent, jobs, crime, transportation, and whether the city's decline could be reversed. What they did not yet fear was an unknown gunman moving between neighbourhoods, choosing victims who appeared to have no connection to him, and leaving police with almost nothing that explained why one person had been attacked instead of another. There is a particular kind of fear created by randomness. When a crime has an obvious motive, people can place boundaries around it. A robbery suggests that the criminal wanted money. A personal dispute suggests that the people involved knew one another. Organised crime, however brutal, follows relationships, territories, and recognisable interests. Random violence gives the public no such comfort. It suggests that normal behaviour may not protect you. It suggests that you can make every reasonable decision and still find yourself in the wrong place simply because another person has decided that your life belongs inside his private fantasy. On July 29th, 1976, Donna Lauria and Jody Valenti returned to the Pelham Bay section of the Bronx after spending the evening out. They sat together in a parked car near Donna's home. It was the sort of scene repeated thousands of times across New York on a summer night. Young people stayed in cars because apartments were crowded, parents were awake, younger siblings were sleeping, and privacy was difficult to find. A parked car could become a temporary living room, a place to finish a conversation before going inside. There was nothing unusual about Donna and Jody being there. That was the point. Shortly after they arrived, a man approached the vehicle. Jody later remembered Donna noticing him. The stranger carried something concealed inside a paper bag. He moved closer, removed a handgun, crouched, and fired through the car window. Donna Lauria, 18 years old, was struck and killed. Jody Valenti was wounded but survived. The attacker escaped before anyone had time to understand what had happened. The first officially recognised shooting in the series had taken place, although no one yet knew that it belonged to a series at all. Imagine the confusion inside that neighbourhood during the minutes that followed. Gunshots break the normal order of a street immediately. Windows open. People step onto sidewalks. Someone calls the police. Someone runs toward the car while another person shouts for everyone to stay back. Sirens approach, growing louder between rows of apartment buildings and houses. Officers arrive and begin asking the first questions. The same questions that must be asked even when the people being questioned are shocked, injured, or unable to make sense of what they have seen. Who was he? Had either woman recognised him? Had there been an argument? Was anything taken? Did he say anything? Which direction did he run? At that moment, the killing did not have a famous nickname. It was not yet part of New York folklore. It belonged first to Donna Lauria's family, to Jody Valenti, to the people who lived nearby, and to the detectives responsible for understanding why a stranger had walked toward a parked car and opened fire. That distinction is important. Famous criminal cases become simplified with time. The victims turn into names on a timeline, while the killer becomes the central figure because he wrote letters, appeared in photographs, behaved strangely, and gave the public a memorable label. But the people inside the original event did not experience it as the opening scene of somebody else's legend. For Donna's family, the important fact was not that a notorious case had begun. The important fact was that Donna had gone out for the evening and had not safely made it through the final few feet of her journey home. The attacker had not entered a dark alley or forced his way into an isolated building. He had come to a residential street. The family home was close. Safety appeared to be close. That made the crime more disturbing, although its full meaning would not become clear until later. Police had a little reason, during those first hours, to announce that a serial gunman was operating in New York. Cities produce coincidences, and investigators cannot responsibly build a theory merely because a crime feels strange. They needed evidence. They needed witnesses, ballistic information, descriptions, and connections. At first there was no letter claiming responsibility, no recognisable public identity, and no established pattern of attacks involving a .44 caliber weapon. There was simply a homicide investigation involving a young woman shot by an unidentified man. For most of New York, the night passed without any knowledge of what had happened. Bakers prepared for the morning, subway workers continued their shifts, newspaper trucks moved through the streets, hospital staff changed rotations. In apartments across the 5 boroughs, people slept beside open windows because air conditioning was not universal and summer heat collected inside brick buildings. Radios played quietly, televisions went dark. Couples remained parked along side streets, unaware that an ordinary activity had just become the setting for an extraordinary crime. The city woke the next morning and continued. That is one of the unsettling truths about history. A major event does not always announce itself at the moment it begins. There may be no immediate sense that a boundary has been crossed. The people who will later describe a summer as unforgettable may begin it without noticing anything unusual. A small article appears in a newspaper. Detectives open a file. A family arranges a funeral. The rest of the population turns the page. Months would pass before the public understood that the attack on Donna Lauria and Jody Valenti was not isolated. The gunman did not follow the pattern people expected from a murderer. He did not remain in one immediate neighbourhood. He did not choose victims who knew him. He did not leave behind an obvious financial motive. He approached people who were talking, walking home, or sitting in cars. He fired quickly and disappeared. Some victims survived. Others did not. Witness descriptions differed, as witness descriptions often do. People saw dark hair, light hair, different clothing, different heights, and different movements. Investigators had to decide which details were reliable and which had been changed by darkness, panic, distance, or memory. That uncertainty would help the attacker remain free. It would also enlarge him in the public imagination. When no one knows what a dangerous person looks like, almost anyone can temporarily resemble him. A man lingering near a car becomes suspicious. A stranger crossing the street too slowly receives a second look. Someone who turns around after passing you may cause your pace to quicken. Fear begins to use ordinary behaviour as raw material. The next known shooting connected to the same gun occurred in October 1976. Carl DeNaro and Rosemary Keenan were sitting in a parked car in Queens when shots struck the vehicle. DeNaro suffered a serious head wound but survived. Keenan was physically unharmed. Once again, the victims did not appear to have a meaningful connection to the attacker. Once again, the shooting happened around a car at night. Investigators still did not have the complete pattern before them, but the pieces were beginning to exist, scattered across precincts and case files. In November, Donna DeMasi and Joanne Lamino were attacked after returning from a movie. A man approached them near Joanne's home in Queens and appeared to ask for directions before producing a gun. Both young women were wounded. Joanne's injuries left her paralysed. The attacker escaped again. By the beginning of 1977, the idea of coincidence was becoming harder to maintain. The shootings occurred in different places, but the similarities demanded attention. The victims were often young. Several attacks involved women with dark hair. Cars repeatedly appeared as locations. The gunman approached at night, struck with little warning, and left without taking property. Ballistics linked attacks involving the same type of .44 caliber weapon, and the press began referring to the unknown attacker as the .44 caliber killer. The name was simple, functional, and frightening because it reduced the man to the weapon he carried. New York now had something it had not possessed after the first shooting: a public pattern. This changed the emotional weight of every attack. A single unsolved murder frightens a neighbourhood. A connected series of murders frightens a city because each new event reaches backward and transforms the ones before it. What once seemed separate becomes evidence of planning. What seemed finished becomes ongoing. A murderer who escaped once begins to look lucky. A murderer who escapes repeatedly begins to look as though he understands the police, the streets, or the behaviour of his victims better than anyone wants to admit. The public did not yet know where he lived or what he did during the day. They did not know whether he was calm after an attack or whether he drove through the city in panic. They did not know whether he had friends, whether he held a job, or whether someone saw him regularly and considered him harmless. People naturally imagined a visible monster because the mind prefers danger to look like danger. The reality was more ordinary, and therefore more troubling. The man responsible could stand in line at a store. He could ride public transportation. He could speak politely to a neighbour. He could report for work. He could walk past police officers without causing them to turn their heads. That was the contradiction at the centre of the fear. New Yorkers were looking for someone who appeared capable of terrifying New York, while the man they sought was capable of appearing forgettable. There is a temptation when telling this story to make the killer seem more powerful than he was. The headlines did that at the time. His letters would later encourage it. His strange explanations would give reporters material that appeared to belong in a horror film. Yet the terror did not come from supernatural power or criminal brilliance. It came from a firearm, surprise, vulnerable victims, inconsistent witness information, and the enormous difficulty of locating one unknown person in a city of millions. New York itself helped conceal him. The city was dense enough to provide witnesses, but also dense enough to produce confusion. A person could be seen by many people and still remain unidentified. Cars moved constantly between boroughs and suburbs. Apartment buildings placed strangers beside one another. Thousands of men roughly matched a general description. Police departments in New York City, Yonkers, and surrounding jurisdictions did not automatically share every suspicion or minor incident in a single central system. Information existed, but information is not the same thing as understanding. The gunman benefited each time a clue seemed too small to matter. He also benefited from the way ordinary people think about ordinary acquaintances. Most of us do not examine every quiet co-worker as a potential murderer. We do not study the habits of every neighbour or ask why a stranger owns a particular car. Society functions because people assume that the person delivering mail, repairing a tyre, standing beside them at a counter, or living in the next apartment is probably what he appears to be. That trust is not foolish. It is necessary. A city could not operate if every interaction became an investigation. The man who would call himself Son of Sam lived inside that trust. By the spring of 1977, the shootings were no longer merely a police problem. They were becoming a shared public experience. Newspaper coverage grew. Detectives received tips from people who believed a relative, neighbour, former boyfriend, co-worker or customer might be the gunman. Most tips led nowhere. Some were sincere. Others came from grudges, misunderstandings, or the human desire to place a known face onto an unknown threat. Every new description made the public search harder. If the attacker had dark hair, men with dark hair drew attention. If a witness mentioned a certain kind of car, drivers of similar cars were noticed. If the newspapers suggested he preferred women with a particular hairstyle, young women began studying themselves as though their appearance might contain a risk they had never chosen. The city's nightlife continued because life rarely stops completely, even under threat. Restaurants remained open, discos filled, couples dated, people left work after dark. Teenagers argued with parents about curfews. Taxi drivers crossed borough lines. Movies ended near midnight, releasing crowds onto sidewalks and parking lots. But an additional calculation entered these routines. Where is the car parked? Is the street well lit? Who is walking behind us? Should we stay here a little longer? Should we leave now? Could that man be watching? Modern life gives us many small safety habits that we perform without thinking. We lock doors, glance into the back seat, keep a phone nearby, and tell someone when we expect to arrive. During the Son of Sam panic, those habits became sharper, because the threat seemed to prefer the exact moments when people normally relaxed. After a date, at the end of a drive, during a conversation in a parked car, or while walking the last short distance home. The killer had discovered that the boundary between public and private life was vulnerable. A car seemed enclosed, but glass did not provide protection from a bullet. A residential street seemed familiar, but familiarity did not prevent a stranger from entering it. Being close to home felt safe, but Donna Lauria had been close to home. That fact stayed with people. As the investigation grew, detectives faced pressure from every direction. Families wanted answers. Reporters wanted developments. City leaders wanted reassurance. The public wanted a description clear enough to use. Police work, however, does not become easier simply because more people are afraid. Pressure can produce resources and urgency, but it can also produce noise. Every telephone call must be evaluated. Every witness must be interviewed. Every similar shooting must be compared. Every weapon recovered in another investigation may need examination. The same city that demanded an immediate solution supplied millions of possible places for the gunman to live, work, hide, or pass unnoticed. By April 1977, the unknown shooter had killed again, and this time he left something behind that would permanently change the case. After Alexander Esau and Valentina Suriani were shot in the Bronx, police discovered a handwritten letter addressed to Captain Joseph Borelli. The writer gave himself a name, Son of Sam. The press had previously known him through his caliber. Now he had supplied a character, a voice, and a phrase short enough to fit across a newspaper front page. A criminal nickname can perform a strange trick. It turns separate acts into one continuing story. It gives the public something to repeat, and the press something to print. It can make the offender seem larger, more organised, and more mysterious than the human being who actually committed the crimes. Son of Sam sounded as though it belonged to a legend, a secret society, or an old warning passed between generations. In reality, it had been chosen by a lonely and violent man who wanted attention and understood that attention could be manipulated. The letter taunted police and promised that the attacks would continue. Its strange language invited interpretation. Detectives studied the handwriting and phrasing. Journalists examined every sentence. Members of the public wondered whether Sam was a real person, a religious reference, a code, or something imagined. The killer had entered the conversation about his own crimes, and would soon use that access to increase the fear surrounding them. This is where the story becomes larger than the gunshots alone. The murderer did not merely attack individuals. He learned how to communicate with the city through its newspapers. Each headline carried his presence farther than he could travel physically. People who lived nowhere near a crime scene now felt included in the threat. The distance between the Bronx, Queens, Brooklyn, and the suburbs seemed to shrink. If he could move between neighborhoods, then no single neighborhood could confidently declare itself outside his reach. Still, behind the frightening name was a man with a birth certificate, an adopted family, a childhood home, school records, military service, jobs, disappointments, resentments, and years of behavior that had developed before New York ever heard of him. He had not appeared from nowhere in the summer of 1976. He had grown up in the city he later frightened. He had lived among the kinds of families who would eventually lock their doors and hurry toward their cars because of him. He had experienced loss, anger, isolation, and humiliation, but so had countless other people who never harmed anyone. Understanding his past does not excuse what he did, and it does not supply one simple cause that makes the violence reasonable. What it does reveal is how an ordinary-looking life can gradually conceal a private world built from grievance, fantasy, and the desire to punish strangers. Before the newspapers called him Son of Sam, before detectives connected the bullets, and before young women changed their evening routines because they feared a man they had never seen, he was David Berkowitz, an adopted boy growing up in the Bronx, trying and often failing to find a stable place for himself in the world around him. To understand how that boy became the man sitting with a revolver in the darkness, we have to leave the frightened streets of 1977 for a while and return to the beginning of his life, long before New York had any reason to know his name. The name David Berkowitz did not sound frightening before the summer of 1977. It was an ordinary New York name, the kind that might appear on a school attendance sheet, an apartment buzzer, a military record, or a payroll envelope. There was nothing in the arrangement of those syllables that warned anyone to step away. The name Son of Sam was different. That name had been created for newspapers, police officers, and frightened strangers. It belonged to the public performance Berkowitz built around his crimes. David Berkowitz belonged to the life underneath it, a life that began 24 years before detectives surrounded his car in Yonkers and discovered that the man they had been hunting looked less like a monster than an exhausted postal worker waiting to be noticed. He was born Richard David Falco in Brooklyn on June 1st, 1953. His biological mother, Elizabeth Broder, was also known as Betty. She was married in name to Tony Falco, though the marriage had broken apart years earlier, and the child's biological father was a married businessman named Joseph Kleinman. The circumstances were complicated, painful, and surrounded by the social expectations of the early 1950s, when an unmarried pregnancy could bring humiliation, financial danger, and pressure that was rarely discussed honestly. Within days of his birth, the infant was placed for adoption. Pearl and Nathan Berkowitz, a childless Jewish couple from the Bronx, adopted him and changed the order of his given names. Richard David Falco became David Richard Berkowitz, their only child. It is easy, knowing what came later, to place too much meaning on that beginning. adoption did not make Berkowitz violent. Millions of adopted children grew into ordinary adults who never harmed anyone. The secrecy surrounding his birth did not place a weapon in his hand. A difficult family history can help explain what a person felt, but it cannot excuse what that person chose to do. That distinction matters because Berkowitz would spend years offering explanations for himself. Some changed with time, some contradicted earlier claims, some appeared designed to attract attention, gain sympathy, frighten an audience, or place responsibility on forces outside himself. The basic facts of his birth are important, but they are not a complete answer. Pearl and Nathan raised David in the Soundview section of the Bronx, among working and middle-class families whose lives were organised around apartment buildings, neighbourhood stores, schools, synagogues, churches, playgrounds, and the daily movement of people going to work. Nathan and Pearl operated a hardware business and lived modestly. They were not wealthy, but David had a stable home and parents who had wanted a child enough to adopt one in middle age. Later accounts often described Pearl as affectionate and protective. Nathan was quieter and more reserved. To neighbours, they could appear like an ordinary small family trying to give their only son a secure upbringing. Now imagine meeting David Berkowitz as a boy without knowing his future. You would not see a criminal mastermind quietly developing behind a perfect disguise. You might see a heavy-set child who was intelligent but difficult, a boy who could be friendly on one day and aggressive on another. Some people later remembered him as a bully. Others remembered anger, petty theft, strange behaviour, or a fascination with fire. He was reportedly teased for his weight and sometimes for being Jewish. His parents became concerned enough about his conduct to seek professional help, although his childhood behaviour did not lead to serious criminal charges or a clear institutional response. He continued through the public school system and eventually attended Christopher Columbus High School. We should be careful whenever childhood memories are collected after someone becomes notorious. Once a name appears across every front page, old neighbours begin searching backward through ordinary encounters. A temper becomes an early sign. An argument becomes a warning. A child setting a small fire becomes evidence that everyone should have understood what was coming. Memory reorganises itself around the ending. Some of the warning signs in Berkowitz's childhood were real. His interest in setting fires would become more serious as he grew older. His anger and social difficulties were noticed, yet there was no straight path visible from a troubled Bronx schoolboy to a man who would shoot strangers in parked cars. Many children behaved badly, many were bullied, many lost parents, struggled in school, or felt unwanted. They did not become murderers. The unsettling point is not that everyone failed to recognise an obvious future killer. It is that no one could know how far this particular boy would eventually permit his resentment to travel. For much of his early life, David believed that Pearl and Nathan were his biological parents. The truth of his adoption was either hidden or softened, as adoption often was during that period. Families sometimes believed secrecy protected a child. Adults used phrases such as chosen child or special child, while avoiding the details that might create difficult questions. The intention could be loving, but the silence left an empty space where a young person might later imagine rejection. At 14, Berkowitz suffered the loss that most accounts of his youth identify as a major emotional rupture. Pearl died of breast cancer in 1967. She had been the parent to whom he seemed most closely attached. Her illness brought fear into the home, and her death left Nathan alone with a teenage son whose behaviour had already caused concern. Berkowitz later described the loss as devastating. His anger deepened, his isolation became more pronounced, and the household that had defined his childhood was suddenly gone. There was nothing unusual about a teenager being damaged by the death of a parent. What mattered was what happened inside Berkowitz afterward. Grief did not settle into one simple emotion. It mixed with resentment, self-pity, confusion, and a growing belief that life had treated him unfairly. Nathan eventually remarried, and David did not develop an easy relationship with his father's new wife. The family moved into Co-op City, the enormous housing development rising in the northeastern Bronx. Nathan later relocated to Florida, leaving his son increasingly responsible for constructing a life of his own. Co-op City was new, ambitious, and enormous. Its towers held thousands of families who had moved there looking for better apartments, modern conveniences, open space, and distance from older neighbourhoods they believed were declining. For a young man already struggling to belong, however, being surrounded by people did not guarantee connection. A person can disappear socially inside a building containing hundreds of apartments. Elevators open and close. Neighbours recognise faces without knowing names. Everyone lives close together while private lives remain sealed behind identical doors. Berkowitz graduated from Christopher Columbus High School in 1971. He was not remembered as a successful student with a clear professional direction. The military offered something that many uncertain young men of his generation found attractive: structure, regular pay, distance from home, and a ready-made identity. The Vietnam War was still underway, though Berkowitz would not become known as a combat soldier in Vietnam. He enlisted in the United States Army and served for 3 years. He was stationed at Fort Knox and later in South Korea, where he served with an infantry unit. Accounts of his military period describe him as a capable marksman, an ability that would take on a much darker meaning after his arrest. He received an honourable discharge in June 1974. The army appears to have contained him more successfully than civilian life did. There were schedules, orders, uniforms, meals, inspections, and consequences. His days did not depend entirely on his own initiative. He had a rank, a unit, and a defined place in a system larger than himself. This did not cure his anger or create lasting stability, but it temporarily gave him a framework in which he could function. Military service has often been treated carelessly in stories about Berkowitz. His ability with firearms is sometimes described as though the army created the killer. That is too simple. Millions of Americans received weapons training and returned to civilian life without committing murder. The army taught Berkowitz how to handle a firearm, but it did not teach him to select innocent people as targets. The choice to use that knowledge against strangers was his own. When he returned to New York in 1974, he was 21 years old and again faced the problem that had followed him before enlistment. He had no strong career, no settled relationship, and no clear sense of where he belonged. The uniform had been removed. The daily instructions were gone. He was back among apartment buildings, traffic, shops, crowded sidewalks, and families whose lives appeared to be moving forward without him. Around this time, Berkowitz searched for his biological mother. He eventually located Betty Broder and met her. She told him more about the circumstances of his birth, and explained that the man whose surname he had carried at birth was not his biological father. His biological father, Joseph Kleinman, had been married to another woman and had not accepted a place for the child in his life. Berkowitz also learned that he had a half-sister. For a young man already preoccupied with rejection, the discovery was deeply upsetting. One later analysis described it as an identity crisis, but even that phrase may sound cleaner than the experience probably was. The story he'd been told about himself had changed again. He visited his birth mother for a time, but the relationship did not become the permanent emotional rescue he may have imagined. She had her own life and history. She could explain the past, but she could not restore the childhood he had lost or replace Pearl. Berkowitz was left with more information and no greater sense of belonging. This is one of the moments where true crime storytelling often makes a serious mistake. It searches for a wound large enough to explain everything that followed. The death of Pearl, the adoption, the rejection by his biological father, loneliness, bullying, military service, and difficulty forming relationships are arranged like pieces of a machine. The implication is that once enough pieces are present, murder becomes inevitable. It was not inevitable. Pain may help us understand the language Berkowitz used inside his own mind, but it does not turn his victims into unavoidable outcomes. Plenty of people learn that a parent did not want them. Plenty return from military service feeling directionless. Plenty are lonely, angry, sexually frustrated, embarrassed, or unable to create the life they expected. They may become bitter. They may withdraw. They may need help. They do not usually spend months preparing to shoot strangers. After leaving the army, Berkowitz tried to create the appearance of an ordinary adult life. He briefly attended Bronx Community College. He worked a series of jobs, including driving for the Co-op City Taxi Company and working as a security guard. By the time of his arrest, he was employed by the United States Postal Service as letter sorter. These were not glamorous positions, but they were legitimate work. They placed him among co-workers and gave his week some structure. Picture him at work for a moment. He sorts envelopes. He handles birthday cards, utility bills, advertisements, letters between relatives, and notices that will change the ordinary lives of people he never meets. A postal facility is repetitive and practical. Mail arrives, is divided, and moves onward. Co-workers may talk about sports, rent, supervisors, weekend plans, and the latest trouble in the city. Berkowitz appears, completes a shift, and goes home. Nothing about the job announces what he is becoming. People who encountered him during these years offered conflicting impressions. Some found him quiet. Some described him as odd or unfriendly. At times he could be helpful. At other moments he seemed angry, suspicious, or difficult. That inconsistency allowed him to remain socially present without becoming well known. He did not need to perform the role of a charming, successful man. He only needed to appear ordinary enough that no one imagined his private activities. His private world was becoming increasingly important to him. He kept notes. He developed grudges. He became intensely sensitive to noises, especially barking dogs. He interpreted inconveniences as deliberate attacks. He began treating neighbours not as people living their own complicated lives, but as characters placed around him to cause suffering. A barking animal was not simply a barking animal, it was persecution. Laughter nearby could become mockery. A couple showing affection could become evidence that the world had given happiness to others while deliberately withholding it from him. This way of thinking allowed resentment to grow without correction. When every frustration is proof of a conspiracy against you, personal responsibility becomes unnecessary. Your loneliness is someone else's crime. Your anger is someone else's creation. Any act of revenge can be presented as a response rather than a choice. Berkowitz also became deeply involved in setting fires. Later accounts state that he kept records of fires he started around New York, though exact totals vary, and many individual claims are difficult to verify. Fire offered several things that appealed to him. It could be prepared privately, observed from a distance, and made to attract emergency vehicles, crowds, and confusion. He could create danger, and then stand among the people watching it. He was no longer merely an unnoticed man in a city. He had secretly caused the event everyone else was discussing. There is something revealing in that pattern. Berkowitz wanted both concealment and recognition. He wanted to act without being stopped, but he also wanted to feel that his actions mattered. He wanted to remain unknown while knowing that strangers were responding to something he had done. The same contradiction would later define the letters signed Son of Sam. He concealed his legal name while creating a public identity large enough for the entire city to repeat. By late 1975, fires were no longer enough. According to Berkowitz's later confession, on Christmas Eve he went outside carrying a hunting knife and attacked 2 women in the Bronx. The first reported victim was never identified with certainty. The second was 15-year-old Michelle Foreman, whom he stabbed repeatedly near Co-op City. She survived after being hospitalized. Berkowitz was not identified as the attacker at the time. The case remained separate from the shootings that would later make him famous. The knife attacks exposed a problem for him. A stabbing required closeness. The attacker had to approach the victim, remain within reach, and risk being seen, resisted, injured, or captured. It was physical and uncertain. Berkowitz later explained that he found the experience unsatisfactory and began thinking about a firearm instead. Early in 1976, he moved away from Co-op City and into a two-family house in Yonkers, just north of the New York City line. Yonkers offered him a small amount of distance from his old life, without truly removing him from the city. The Bronx remained close. Queens and Brooklyn could be reached by car. At night, he could move through neighborhoods where no one knew him and return to a home outside the jurisdiction of the detectives who might eventually search for him. The first Yonkers residents did not bring peace. Berkowitz complained about dogs and neighbors. He sent threatening letters and developed elaborate grievances against people living nearby. He later moved again, this time into a small apartment at 35 Pine Street. Nearby lived the Carr family. Sam Carr owned a black Labrador retriever named Harvey, whose barking irritated Berkowitz. The names Sam Carr and Harvey would later be pulled into the bizarre story Berkowitz told after his arrest, when he claimed that demonic commands had travelled through the dog and forced him to kill. He eventually admitted that the famous dog story was a fabrication. That later confession is worth remembering before accepting any supernatural explanation. Berkowitz was not a reliable narrator of his own life. He changed stories when new stories benefited him. The dog allowed him to appear controlled by something outside himself. Talk of demons made the crime seem mysterious and almost beyond human understanding. It distracted from motives that were more ordinary and more unpleasant. Rage, envy, sexual resentment, the desire for attention, and the decision to make strangers suffer because he believed he had suffered. In Yonkers, his behaviour toward the Carr family became threatening. Letters arrived. Their property was targeted. Harvey was shot and wounded. These incidents did not immediately lead anyone to connect Berkowitz with a series of murders, because the murders had not yet begun in a recognisable way. To the Carrs, he could appear to be a disturbed neighbour engaged in harassment. To the people at his workplace, he remained an employee. To police in another jurisdiction, his name meant nothing. During these months, Berkowitz acquired the weapon that would give the investigation its first public nickname, a .44 caliber Charter Arms Bulldog revolver. It was a compact handgun, easy to carry and powerful at close range. He practiced with it. His military training meant he did not need to learn the basic mechanics from the beginning. The distance that had frustrated him with a knife was no longer a problem. He could approach quickly, fire through glass, and run before witnesses understood what they had seen. Nothing about buying or possessing the revolver required him to announce what he intended to do. A gun can remain hidden inside a bag, beneath clothing, or in a car. The person carrying it can still buy food, speak to a cashier, report for work, and pass through a neighbourhood without attracting attention. The weapon changed what Berkowitz was capable of doing, while leaving his outward appearance almost untouched. By the summer of 1976, the pieces of his hidden life had come together. He had a car that allowed him to move between neighbourhoods. He had a firearm. He had experience using weapons. He had spent years feeding grievances rather than challenging them. He had crossed the boundary from fantasy to arson, then from arson to attacking women with a knife. Most dangerously, he had learned that violence could make him feel powerful, and that he could escape without being recognised. On July 28th, he left his job as a security guard. Later that night, or shortly after midnight on July 29th, he drove into the Bronx carrying the .44 caliber revolver. He was not yet son of Sam. No letters had been discovered. No special police task force existed. Women with dark hair had no reason to study newspaper sketches. Couples sitting in cars did not believe they were participating in a dangerous pattern. Near Bure Avenue in Pelham Bay, 18-year-old Donna Lauria and 19-year-old Jody Valenti were sitting in Jody's Oldsmobile after an evening out. Donna's home was only a short distance away. They were talking before saying goodnight, surrounded by houses, parked vehicles, and the ordinary quiet of a residential street. Berkowitz approached, carrying the revolver inside a paper bag. The life behind the name had reached the moment when its private violence would become part of New York's public history, and the first shots were only seconds away. The revolver came out of the paper bag before Donna Lauria or Jody Valenti had time to understand why the stranger had approached them. 3 shots were fired into the Oldsmobile. Donna was struck in the neck and killed. Jody was wounded in the thigh. The gunman walked away quickly, disappearing into the Bronx night while the sounds of the shots brought Donna's father and nearby residents toward the car. What had begun inside David Berkowitz as a collection of grievances, fantasies, and earlier acts of violence had now become a public murder on a residential street. For decades, accounts of the Son of Sam case described Donna and Jody as Berkowitz's first shooting victims. That was how investigators understood the sequence during the original manhunt. In 2024, however, the New York Police Department reportedly linked Berkowitz to an earlier attack on Wendy Savino, who had been shot 5 times while sitting in a car in the Bronx on April 9th, 1976. Savino survived but lost an eye. The conclusion came nearly half a century after the crime, long after the historical timeline had settled around the attack on Donna Lauria. Whatever place that earlier shooting now holds in the complete record, the case that frightened New York began publicly on July 29th, because Donna's death was the first event that would eventually be connected to the weapon and pattern the city came to know. The first police officers who arrived near Bureau Avenue did not know they were standing at the beginning of a 13-month pursuit. They treated the scene as a homicide and attempted murder, not as the work of a serial attacker. Detectives examined the car, collected the bullets they could recover, interviewed Jody, and spoke with anyone who might have noticed a stranger or an unfamiliar vehicle. Jody described a heavy-set white man with short, dark, curly hair. She believed he was in his 30s, around 5 feet 8 inches tall and perhaps 200 pounds. It was a useful description, but hardly a rare one in a city containing millions of people. Darkness had limited what she could see. The attack had lasted seconds. Shock could alter the order in which details returned to memory. No property had been taken. There had been no argument and no apparent connection between the women and the shooter. Donna was not involved in a criminal dispute. Jody could not give detectives the name of a threatening acquaintance who owned a large revolver. The gunman had not delivered a speech or announced a motive. He had simply approached, fired, and left. Investigators are trained to search for relationships, because most violence grows from relationships. Victims are often harmed by relatives, partners, acquaintances, rivals, or people connected to their work. Even robberies provide a recognizable purpose. A stranger who attacks without taking anything removes the usual map that detectives follow. Police could ask who hated Donna Lauria, but hatred may not have been the reason she was chosen. They could investigate her movements that evening, but the gunman may not have known them in advance. They could question people in the neighborhood, yet the attacker did not necessarily belong to the neighborhood. Every reasonable direction risked leading away from the answer, because the answer was sitting in a small Yonkers apartment, unconnected to either victim and still unknown to the officers handling the case. The murder appeared in newspapers, but New York did not stop moving. Donna's family entered the private ordeal of funeral arrangements and grief. Jody began recovering from her wound and from the knowledge that a few inches had separated survival from death. Detectives continued working the file. Across the city, young couples sat in parked cars because they had always sat in parked cars. No one had yet been told that the activity itself might make them vulnerable. Berkowitz returned to his ordinary routine. He could drive back to Yonkers, put away the revolver, report for work, and listen as people discussed the murder without realizing the person responsible was close enough to hear them. The distance between the public crime and the private man protected him. No witness followed him home. No license plate had been clearly recorded. No letter carried his handwriting into a police file. He had learned something dangerous from the first recognized attack. He could approach strangers, shoot them, escape, and resume his life. Nearly 3 months passed. On October 23rd, 1976, 20-year-old Carl Denaro and 18-year-old Rosemary Keenan were sitting in a parked car in a residential section of Flushing, Queens. They were talking when the window suddenly shattered. In the confusion, they did not immediately understand that someone had fired into the vehicle. Rosemary started the car and drove away seeking help. Carl had been struck in the head by a bullet and would require extensive medical treatment, but he survived. Rosemary suffered injuries from the broken glass rather than a direct gunshot wound. Neither of them had seen the attacker clearly enough to provide the police with the face detectives needed. Again, there was no robbery, warning, or obvious motive. Another young pair had been attacked while sitting in a car at night. The similarities now seem impossible to miss, especially when viewed from the far side of the completed case. In October 1976, they were less obvious. The shootings had occurred in different boroughs. The first was being investigated in the Bronx, the second in Queens. New York policing was divided among precincts, squads, commands, and specialized units. Detectives communicated, but they did not possess the instant searchable databases that modern investigators take for granted. Reports were typed, copied, filed, telephoned, and physically carried. The detail known in one precinct did not immediately appear on every investigator's desk elsewhere. The victims also complicated the apparent pattern. Donna and Jody were two young women. Carl was a young man sitting beside a woman. Police later considered the possibility that Berkowitz, seeing Carl's shoulder-length hair in the darkness, had mistaken him for a woman. At the time, however, the attack did not present itself neatly as the work of a killer targeting dark-haired women. It could have been a personal dispute, a mistaken identity, a random shooting, or a crime committed by someone entirely unrelated to the Bronx gunman. The bullets offered information, but not yet a name. Investigators determined that the Queens vehicle had been struck by .44 caliber rounds. The caliber was unusual enough to attract attention, but bullets damaged by metal, glass and impact do not always preserve the markings needed to identify one exact firearm. A connection could be suspected without being proved in a way that solved either case. Berkowitz had once again fired into a car and vanished before the victims understood what was happening. The method required little conversation and allowed him to maintain distance. Glass offered the appearance of separation without real protection. The occupants were seated, their movement restricted by doors, seats, and the narrow interior. By the time they reacted, he could already be leaving. A month later, he changed the setting slightly. On the night of November 27th, 16-year-old Donna DeMasi and 18-year-old Joanne Lamino attended a movie in Queens. Afterward, they returned to the Floral Park neighborhood where Joanne lived. They were near her home when a man approached wearing what witnesses described as military-style clothing. He asked for directions, creating a brief and ordinary social exchange. Then he produced a revolver. Donna was shot in the neck. Joanne was struck in the back. Additional shots were fired as the attacker escaped. Both young women survived, but Joanne's spinal injury left her paralyzed. The attack contained a detail that made it especially disturbing. The gunman had spoken first. Asking for directions is one of the simplest ways a stranger enters another person's attention. It asks for cooperation. It encourages the listener to pause, turn, and perhaps move closer. Most people respond automatically, because helping someone locate a street or building feels harmless. Berkowitz used that ordinary courtesy to control the moment before the shooting. Afterward, the ritual of investigation began again. Ambulances arrived. The area was searched. Officers tried to determine where the man had gone and whether a car had been waiting. Detectives listened carefully to the survivor's description. The clothing suggested military experience to some observers, but military-style jackets and trousers were widely available. Thousands of veterans lived in New York. Thousands of young men wore surplus clothing because it was cheap, practical, or fashionable. The attacker's appearance still refused to become fixed. One witness remembered him one way, another slightly differently. Height estimates shifted, age estimates widened, hair could look darker or lighter under street lamps, a cap or jacket changed the shape of a body. Detectives were not looking for a man whose photograph they possessed. They were attempting to construct him from moments of fear. The 3 attacks shared important elements. The victims were young. Women with dark hair appeared repeatedly. 2 incidents involved parked cars. All happened at night in residential neighbourhoods. A large caliber handgun had been used and nothing had been stolen. There were also differences. The first shooting occurred in the Bronx, the next 2 in Queens. Some victims were couples, while Donna DeMasi and Joanne Lamino had been walking together. Some victims saw almost nothing. Others saw a man approaching. No message had been left behind. The intervals between attacks were irregular. Police did not know whether the gunman was one person, several people, or whether only some of the cases were connected. The city remained largely unaware that these separate police files might describe the same man. People living near the crime scenes knew the fear directly. They looked at strangers differently for days or weeks. Parents warned daughters to come home earlier. Neighbours discussed the latest description and compared it to men they had noticed nearby. Farther away, most New Yorkers continued to treat the shootings as local crimes in a city where crime reports were already common. That would change on January 30th, 1977. Christine Freund was 26 years old. She and her fiancé, 30-year-old John Deal, had gone to see the film Rocky and were planning to continue their evening at dance hall. They were sitting in John's car near the Forest Hills Long Island Railroad station in Queens when gunfire struck the vehicle shortly after midnight. John reacted by driving away, trying to reach help while the situation was still unfolding. He suffered minor injuries. Christine had been shot twice and died several hours later at hospital. The death forced investigators to look again at the earlier files. Another young woman with dark hair had been attacked while sitting in a parked car. The weapon was again a .44 caliber. The crime appeared to have no conventional motive. Police publicly acknowledged for the first time that the Freund shooting resembled previous attacks, and that the cases might be connected. Investigators were still considering the possibility of more than one suspect, but a pattern was entering public discussion. This moment altered the meaning of the earlier shootings. Donna Lauria was no longer only the victim of an isolated Bronx murder. Carl Denaro and Rosemary Keenan had not simply encountered an unknown gunman in Queens. Donna DeMasi and Joanne Lamino had not been attacked by a stranger whose violence ended when he ran away. The same person might still be moving through New York, carrying the same revolver and searching for another opportunity. The newspapers now had the beginnings of a continuing story. The weapon supplied the first useful label. Before anyone had heard the words "Son of Sam," the press began calling the attacker the .44 caliber killer. It was not yet the theatrical identity Berkowitz would later provide, but it allowed readers to connect new reports with the old ones. A caliber became a warning. The label also simplified a complicated investigation. There were different witnesses, different neighbourhoods, and different victim arrangements, but the number .44 tied them together. Readers did not need to remember every street or name. They understood that a powerful handgun had appeared repeatedly, and that the person carrying it had not been caught. For detectives, the connection created urgency, but not clarity. If one gun was responsible, they needed to identify everyone in the city who possessed such a weapon, had threatened women, resembled the sketches, or had some link to the locations. Gun records could be incomplete. A revolver could have been purchased elsewhere, stolen, transferred privately, or kept without authorities knowing. The Charter Arms Bulldog used by Berkowitz was compact enough to conceal and powerful enough to fire the ammunition recovered from the scenes. Police examined tips. They questioned suspicious individuals and checked alibis. They compared accounts from surviving victims. Officers watched neighbourhoods where the gunman had struck, yet every new patrol could only cover one small part of a vast city. Berkowitz did not need to outsmart every detective. He needed to avoid the specific officer who happened to be present on the specific street at the moment he chose to act. The absence of a stable description caused growing frustration. Some witnesses believed the gunman was heavy. Others described a thinner figure. Hair appeared curly in one account and straighter in another. Ages ranged widely. These disagreements later encouraged theories that Berkowitz had accomplices, although he confessed to the shootings and was convicted as the sole gunman. During the active investigation, the conflicting descriptions meant that police could not simply circulate one portrait and wait for a neighbour to call. Berkowitz understood that the city was beginning to notice him. The headlines confirmed that his actions had crossed from private fantasy into public attention. People he would never meet were discussing the weapon he carried. Police officials were answering questions about him. Reporters were placing his attacks beside one another. That attention did not frighten him into stopping. It rewarded him. 5 weeks after Christine Freund's death, he returned to the same general area of Queens. On March 8th, 19-year-old Virginia Voskarishian was walking home after attending classes at Barnard College. She was an honour student and lived with her family in Forest Hills. As she approached her home during the evening, a man moved toward her. Virginia apparently saw the weapon and raised books or notebooks in front of her face in an instinctive attempt to protect herself. The gunman fired. She was struck in the head and died at the scene. Her home was only about a block from the place where Christine Freund had been shot in January. This time there was no parked car and no companion sitting beside the victim. Virginia was alone and moving through a familiar neighbourhood. The attack showed that the gunman was not dependent on couples or vehicles. The essential element was vulnerability. He wanted a victim he could approach quickly and surprise. The proximity to the Freund shooting intensified the response. 2 days later, police publicly stated that they strongly suspected the same .44 caliber Bulldog revolver had been used. Newspaper coverage became frequent, and the unknown gunman was no longer a collection of loosely related rumours. He was a recognised threat operating in Queens and the Bronx. Residents began examining the geography. Forest Hills was not an abandoned district where violence could be dismissed as part of a distant urban collapse. It was a neighbourhood of apartment buildings, private homes, shops, restaurants, schools, and commuter stations. Families had chosen it because it felt established. Virginia had been returning from college to her own front door. If a young woman could be shot there, people asked where safety actually began. New Yorkers looked at the composite sketches and tried to decide whether the face seemed familiar. Men who vaguely resembled the drawings found themselves watched. Women with long, dark hair heard warnings that they might match the apparent preference of the attacker. Couples reconsidered remaining in parked cars after dark. Parents who had once asked only when a daughter would be home now wanted to know exactly how she would travel and who would walk beside her. The public still did not know what the gunman called himself. There was no demon story, no Sam Carr, no letter addressed to a police captain, and no message to Jimmy Breslin. The fear was built from the attacks themselves. That made it harder to explain. New York was searching for a motive because motive offers the illusion of protection. If the killer hated one specific person, everyone else could feel safer. If he robbed victims, people could avoid carrying money. If he operated in one neighbourhood, other neighbourhoods could pretend the danger stopped at a familiar avenue. Berkowitz gave them none of those boundaries. He crossed borough lines. He waited weeks or months. He attacked women alone, women together, and couples inside cars. He selected victims who had never heard his name and had done nothing to attract his attention except enter his view at the wrong moment. Behind the scenes, the investigation was becoming larger. Detectives revisited witnesses. Ballistics work strengthened the connection among shootings. Police leaders faced questions from reporters who wanted a clear description, an arrest, or at least an explanation for how the same man could continue striking. Each day without an answer increased the pressure. Berkowitz watched all of it from outside the investigation. He could read the papers on his way to work. He could see his crimes being reorganized into a single public narrative. The city had recognized that someone was hunting, but it still knew him only through bullets, locations, and the uncertain memories of people who had survived him. He wanted more than that. During the early hours of April 17th, 1977, 18-year-old Valentina Suriani and 20-year-old Alexander Esau were sitting together in Valentina's car near her home in the Bronx. Berkowitz approached and fired. Both were struck twice. Alexander died at the scene. Valentina was taken to a hospital but also died. Police searched the area, examined the car, and began the now familiar work of gathering evidence. Near the scene, however, they found something Berkowitz had not left after the earlier attacks. It was a handwritten letter addressed to an officer involved in the investigation. The gunman who had hidden behind a caliber was ready to introduce himself, and the name written on the page would soon travel through every police precinct, newspaper office, television studio, barbershop, apartment, and frightened household in New York. The letter lay near the bodies of Valentina Suriani and Alexander Esau after the police arrived on the morning of April 17, 1977. It was not hidden carefully, and it was not an accidental piece of paper dropped by someone passing through the neighbourhood. It had been left for the investigators. The envelope was addressed to Captain Joseph Borelli of the New York City Police Department, a man whose name had appeared in newspaper coverage of the shootings. The unknown gunman had been reading what was written about him, and for the first time, he was ready to answer. Inside was a handwritten message filled with misspellings, strange expressions, threats, and references that made little immediate sense. The writer denied that he hated women, then contradicted the denial by describing himself as something inhuman. Near the beginning, he announced, "I am a monster. I am the son of Sam." It was the first known use of the name that would soon replace the more practical newspaper label of the .44 caliber killer. Until that moment, the police had been pursuing a man defined mainly by a weapon. A .44 caliber revolver had connected the attacks. The bullets, the parked cars, the dark-haired victims, and the uncertain witness descriptions were the evidence from which investigators attempted to construct him. He had no public voice. He had not explained himself, claimed credit, or provided a name. The letter changed that. It did not bring detectives closer to identifying David Berkowitz in any simple way. It contained no return address, employment history, or honest account of where he lived. Much of it appeared deliberately confusing. The writer described a figure named Sam as a violent father who drank blood, mistreated his family, and kept the writer locked away. He wrote about hunting, killing, and returning to attack again. The language moved between childish complaint and calculated threat, as though the author wanted the police to imagine both a mistreated son and a creature beyond ordinary human control. Captain Borelli and the investigators now faced a new problem. They were no longer examining only a series of shootings. They were examining a personality that the shooter had created specifically for them. Think for a moment about the difference between a name and a description. The phrase .44 caliber killer tells you what weapon a criminal carries. It sounds like something that belongs in a police report. Son of Sam tells you almost nothing factual, but it creates an entire room of questions. Who was Sam? Was Sam the killer's father? Was the writer really someone's son? Was the name religious? Was it a code? Was there more than one person involved? Was the writer mentally ill, pretending to be mentally ill, or attempting to send investigators toward the wrong kind of suspect? Every one of those questions required time, and time was the one resource the police could not safely waste. The full letter was initially kept from the public while detectives and specialists examined it. They studied the paper, handwriting, spelling, punctuation, and unusual phrases. They considered whether the writer's errors were genuine or deliberately inserted. They looked for regional expressions and references that might reveal where he'd grown up, what he read, or how educated he was. The letter appeared crude in places, but crude writing does not necessarily come from an unintelligent person. A person trying to appear disturbed may exaggerate disorder. A person trying to appear poorly educated may misspell words on purpose. Handwriting analysis offered possibilities, but not an identity. A sample is useful only when police have another sample with which to compare it. Somewhere in New York or Yonkers, Berkowitz had filled out job forms, written complaints, addressed envelopes, and sent threatening notes to neighbours. The writing that could expose him existed, but it sat in files and homes that the task force had no reason to examine. Police also consulted psychologists and psychiatrists, hoping the letter might reveal the kind of man they were searching for. The profile that emerged described a likely loner, someone socially isolated, suspicious, angry, and unable to form normal relationships, particularly with women. That portrait would later appear remarkably close to Berkowitz in some respects. It was still far too broad to produce an arrest. New York contained thousands of isolated men, thousands of unhappy men, and thousands of people who had received psychiatric treatment. The overwhelming majority were not murderers. The task force under Deputy Inspector Timothy Dowd expanded the search. By the summer, dozens of detectives were checking tips, comparing handwriting, examining registered .44 caliber weapons, interviewing witnesses, and reviewing the backgrounds of every known victim. A contemporary account described roughly 50 detectives assigned to the core effort and thousands of leads requiring attention. They interviewed more than 1,000 people, examined large numbers of guns and handwriting samples, and followed calls from citizens who believed they knew the killer. The letter increased the number of those calls almost immediately. Once portions of the message reached the newspapers, the gunman became something New Yorkers could discuss as though he were a recognizable person. The name Son of Sam appeared in headlines, radio reports, and television broadcasts. It was brief, memorable, and easy to repeat. People who could not list every victim or remember the location of each shooting remembered the name. That is what Berkowitz wanted. His crimes had already produced fear, but the letter gave him control over the language of that fear. Instead of allowing police and reporters to decide what to call him, he supplied the title himself. He had turned an unknown postal worker from Yonkers into a character who seemed to belong to the entire city. There is something important to understand about New York newspapers in 1977. The city was still a newspaper city in a way that is difficult to imagine now. Morning papers were read on subways, at kitchen tables, in coffee shops, on construction sites, and behind store counters. Copies were folded under arms and left on bus seats. Headlines displayed at newsstands could reach people who never purchased the paper. The Daily News and the New York Post competed fiercely for attention, especially when crime, scandal, politics, or celebrity offered a story that could be told in large type across the front page. The Son of Sam case contained nearly everything a tabloid newspaper could use. There was an unknown killer, young victims, nighttime attacks, contradictory witnesses, a powerful weapon, a massive police search, and now a letter filled with strange claims. Each shooting supplied photographs, maps, interviews, sketches, and new theories. Each day without an arrest made the next headline easier to write because uncertainty itself had become news. Reporters were doing legitimate work. The public needed to know that a dangerous gunman remained free. Descriptions might produce a witness. Coverage could encourage people to take sensible precautions. Families of victims wanted the crimes remembered, not pushed aside because the city had other problems. The police also needed the public's assistance. At the same time, newspapers sold more copies when fear was intense. That created a relationship no one could control completely. Berkowitz wanted attention. The newspapers needed information. The public wanted every available detail. Police wanted useful publicity without giving the killer satisfaction or encouraging copycats. Each group depended on the others while distrusting what the others might do. No one understood this world better than Jimmy Breslin. Breslin was one of the city's most famous columnists, a writer known for finding ordinary people inside enormous stories. He wrote about bartenders, gravediggers, police officers, widows, politicians, labourers, and the people standing outside the room where more polished reporters had gathered. His columns sounded like New York because they were filled with its voices, arguments, humour, impatience, and grief. Berkowitz read him. On May 30th, 1977, an envelope addressed to Breslin arrived at the Daily News. It had been postmarked in Englewood, New Jersey. The writing was carefully arranged in block letters, and the back of the envelope carried several dramatic phrases about blood, family, darkness, death, and the number .44. Inside was a longer letter signed Son of Sam. The tone differed somewhat from the letter left for Captain Borelli. It was still disturbing and theatrical, but the writer seemed more aware of his audience. He opened with a description of New York's gutters, sewers, sidewalks, filth, and blood. He referred to the city almost as though it were a living organism that had produced him. He praised Breslin in a strange way, telling him, "I read your column daily," and continued with references to Sam, future killings, and the approaching anniversary of the first publicly recognised attack. The fact that Berkowitz wrote to a columnist rather than another police officer was not accidental. A police letter entered an investigation. A newspaper letter could enter hundreds of thousands of homes. Breslin immediately turned the message over to the police. Investigators examined it and concluded that it probably came from the man they were hunting. The handwriting and symbols were compared with the first letter. Experts looked for fingerprints, linguistic clues, and physical evidence. Police asked the Daily News to withhold certain portions that might help them distinguish the real writer from the growing number of people claiming knowledge of the case. For several days, the existence of the letter remained a controlled secret. Editors, reporters, detectives, and city officials understood that publication would produce an enormous reaction. They also understood that keeping it hidden indefinitely was unrealistic. Other newspapers were competing for the story. Rumours were spreading. Berkowitz had written to a journalist because he expected to be heard. On June 6th, the Daily News published the letter with parts removed at the request of police. The edition became one of the newspaper's largest selling issues, and the words of the killer moved from an evidence room into apartments, offices, restaurants, taxis, subway cars, and beauty salons across the city. Try to imagine opening that paper at breakfast. You already know that several young people have been shot. You know the police have not found the gunman. You may have a daughter with dark hair, a son who sits in parked cars with his girlfriend, or a job that requires you to travel home after midnight. Then you see that the killer has written directly to a columnist you read. He discusses the city in which you live. He appears to know that everyone is watching. He hints at future violence. The distance between criminal and reader suddenly becomes smaller. Breslin used his own column to address the writer. He urged him to surrender, presenting the act not as defeat but as the only way to end the private torment suggested by the letters. The appeal was partly an attempt to keep communication open. If Berkowitz continued writing, he might reveal a location, a name, or some small physical clue. A letter could also delay an attack if composing and sending it satisfied part of his need for attention. Police officials spoke carefully about the possibility of establishing contact. Dowd compared the situation to negotiating with a person holding hostages. The difficulty was that the police could not speak directly to the gunman. They could only send messages through reporters and hope that he read them. Berkowitz had created an unusual form of control. He could write when he wished, remain silent when he wished, and watch strangers publicly interpret his words. Every response confirmed that he had been heard. Reporters examined his vocabulary. Psychiatrists discussed his personality. Police officials answered questions about his threats. Readers debated whether Sam was a person, a demon, an organisation, or a fantasy. The less the city knew, the more material imagination supplied. Some readers studied the symbols at the bottom of the Breslin letter. Others focused on unusual names and phrases. investigators considered whether the lettering resembled comic book work, and reportedly asked people in publishing whether they recognised the style. References that appeared connected to films, folklore, religion, or popular culture sent detectives into new directions. Every interpretation had to be considered because one apparently ridiculous detail might contain the useful clue. Most led nowhere. Tips arrived by the thousands. People reported quiet neighbours, angry relatives, former boyfriends, customers who owned guns, men who disliked dogs, and anyone whose handwriting appeared similar to the newspaper reproductions. Some callers genuinely believed they were helping. Others used the investigation to settle old grudges. A few wanted attention for themselves. The task force had to examine enough of these reports to avoid overlooking the one correct name. This is one of the least dramatic but most important realities of a major manhunt. Detectives do not spend every hour racing through streets with sirens on. They spend enormous amounts of time reading forms, making telephone calls, checking addresses, requesting records, waiting for replies, and discovering that a promising lead belongs to a man who was in another state when the crime occurred. The letters multiplied that labour. They also caused debate inside the press. Some journalists argue that the public had a right to know, and that publication might help the investigation. Others worried that the newspapers were giving the killer exactly what he wanted. The New Yorker later criticised the intense tabloid coverage, arguing that the constant attention had helped transform the gunman into a celebrity and may have encouraged his desire to continue. There was no simple answer. Silence might have denied Berkowitz attention, but it also would have hidden a public danger and reduced the chance that a reader might recognise the handwriting. Publication informed the city but enlarged the identity he had invented. The papers could not print the letter without becoming part of the story, and they could not ignore it without appearing to conceal information from frightened readers. Berkowitz understood this tension even if he could not have described it in professional language. He knew that murder had made the newspapers write about him, and writing to the newspapers had made them print his own words. A man who felt invisible now had the most famous columnist in the city responding to him. The public personality became larger than the actual man. Son of Sam sounded cunning, mobile, and almost impossible to locate. David Berkowitz was living alone in a small Yonkers apartment, sorting mail during his working hours, arguing with neighbours and driving an aging car. The city imagined a figure who moved through darkness with complete confidence. Berkowitz often wandered, hesitated, failed to find victims, or left areas when circumstances did not suit him. He was dangerous, but he was not supernatural. The letters encourage people to forget that. His reference to July 29th caused particular concern. It was the anniversary of the Laria Valenti shooting, the date generally understood at the time as the beginning of the series. The wording in the Breslin letter suggested that the anniversary might bring another attack. Police could not dismiss the possibility as empty performance. Berkowitz had already proved that his threats could become gunfire. Until then, the intervals between shootings had provided small periods of relief. Weeks passed, and some people began hoping the gunman had left the city, lost the weapon, died, or decided to stop. The letters removed that comfort. They described violence as unfinished work. The writer wanted everyone to know that silence did not mean absence. Newspaper coverage now began following not only what Berkowitz had done, but what he might do next. That difference placed the entire city in a waiting position. Reporters looked toward dates mentioned in the letters. Police patrols increased in neighbourhoods that resembled previous locations. Detectives watched lovers' lanes, parked cars, discos and streets near the earlier attacks. Television crews interviewed young women about whether they were afraid. Men whose appearance resembled a composite sketch found themselves observed by passengers on trains and customers in stores. Berkowitz could see the results each morning. He had entered New York's routine. His name appeared beside weather reports, political disputes, sports scores, and advertisements. The city did not need a new shooting to remember him. The papers carried him forward. Then, shortly after 3 o'clock on the morning of June 26th, 17-year-old Judy Placido and 20-year-old Sal Lupo left the Elephas Disco in Bayside, Queens. The son of Sam case had been discussed inside the club that night. Sal had reportedly mentioned the danger as he and Judy prepared to leave, though neither believed the gunman was waiting for them personally. They entered Sal's parked car. A man approached and fired through the vehicle. Judy was struck several times. Sal was also wounded. Both survived. 4.44 caliber shots had been fired, and investigators connected the attack to the same gunman who had written to Borelli and Breslin. The letters had not replaced the shootings. They had announced that the shootings would continue. For New Yorkers who had hoped the strange messages represented a man reaching the end of his violence, the Bayside attack destroyed that possibility. Berkowitz had written, watched his words fill the newspapers, and then returned to a parked car. The public name and the physical danger were now inseparable. From that point onward, reading about Son of Sam was no longer something that ended when the newspaper was folded. His presence followed people outside. It entered the moment when a restaurant door closed behind them, when a disco emptied, when a young woman crossed a parking lot, and when a couple decided whether to remain in a car for 5 more minutes. The headlines had taught the city his name. The next part of the fear would be taught by ordinary nights, when New Yorkers began changing their hair, their plans, their routes home, and the way they looked at every unfamiliar man standing near the curb. By the beginning of the summer of 1977, fear no longer belonged only to the families of the victims or the detectives assigned to the investigation. It had entered the ordinary routines of New York. It was present when a young woman decided how to wear her hair before leaving home. It sat between parents and daughters during arguments about curfews. It followed couples from restaurants and movie theatres into parking lots. It appeared whenever a man slowed near a car, whenever footsteps continued behind someone for more than half a block, and whenever a dog barked outside an apartment window after midnight. The city knew the name Son of Sam. It knew the weapon was a .44 caliber revolver. It knew that the gunman had attacked young people in the Bronx, Queens and Brooklyn, usually at night and often near parked cars. Beyond those facts, very little felt certain. Witness descriptions remained inconsistent. The composite sketches seemed to show different faces. The letters suggested a disturbed man who wanted attention, but they did not reveal where he would appear next. New Yorkers were being asked to protect themselves from someone who had no reliable face and no fixed territory. That uncertainty gave the fear its power. When danger has a clear boundary, people build their behaviour around it. They avoid one street, one building, or one neighbourhood. They do not carry expensive jewellery. They travel with another person. They make a rule and feel that following it has reduced the risk. The Son of Sam attacks did not allow such confidence. Some victims had been sitting in cars, others had been walking, some were alone, while others had companions. Several had dark, shoulder-length hair, but not every victim matched the same appearance. The gunman had struck in residential neighbourhoods that people considered familiar. He disappeared for weeks, then returned without warning. A person could obey every warning printed in the newspaper and still wonder whether the warnings were based on a real pattern or merely the city's desperate attempt to create one. The most visible response involved women's hair. Newspapers and television reports repeatedly noted that many of the female victims had long or shoulder-length dark hair. Police and journalists discussed the possibility that the gunman preferred brunettes. Hair salons began receiving customers who wanted their hair cut short, bleached blonde, or restyled so that it no longer resembled the photographs appearing beside reports of the shootings. Some women tied long hair into ponytails. Others wore wigs, hats, or loose clothing when going out. Parents urged daughters to change their appearance even when the daughters believed the idea was ridiculous. It is difficult to know exactly how many women made those changes because of Berkowitz alone. Not every brunette in New York ran to a salon, and not every haircut in 1977 was an act of fear. Shorter styles were already fashionable. The press naturally focused on the most dramatic examples because a woman cutting off her hair provided a visible image of the city's anxiety. Yet the behaviour was real enough to become one of the defining memories of that summer. Imagine being a young woman standing before a mirror and examining your own hair as though it had become evidence against you. The colour and length were not dangerous in themselves. They had been part of your appearance for years. Then a stranger with a revolver created the possibility that these ordinary details might attract him. You could cut your hair, but there was no guarantee that the newspapers had identified his preference correctly. You could dye it, but another attack might reveal a completely different pattern. The result was not genuine control. It was the performance of control, which can still be comforting when no better protection is available. Parents reacted in more direct ways. Daughters were told to return home earlier. Some families encouraged young couples to spend their dates inside the family apartment, where a mother, father, or younger sibling might be only a room away. Others asked for telephone calls at each stage of the evening, one after arriving at a restaurant, another before leaving, and another when the daughter reached home. Young women sometimes avoided dating entirely until the gunman was caught, while those who continued going out found themselves negotiating with parents who considered every parked car a possible crime scene. These restrictions created arguments because fear does not remove the desire to live normally. A 19-year-old who had spent years waiting for adult independence did not necessarily accept being told to stay in the living room on a Saturday night. A father could point to a newspaper photograph of a victim. A daughter could answer that millions of people went out without being attacked. Both statements were true. New York's young people continued attending movies, restaurants, bars, discos, parties, and neighbourhood gatherings. They continued meeting dates because the alternative was allowing an unknown man to close the city completely. But the movement between those places changed. The walk from a club to a car became something to plan. Couples asked attendants to watch them cross a parking lot. Friends left together rather than separately. A woman who had once waited alone outside a building might remain inside until her ride appeared. Drivers checked the area before unlocking doors and tried to park beneath streetlights. Parked cars had become especially uncomfortable. For generations of young New Yorkers, a car had offered a small pocket of privacy in a crowded city. Apartments were shared with parents, grandparents, brothers, sisters, and sometimes extended family. Walls were thin. Bedrooms were scarce. A vehicle parked on a residential street allowed a couple to talk without an entire household listening. Berkowitz turned that privacy into vulnerability. A car restricted movement. The occupants faced forward or toward each other rather than watching the sidewalk. Music or conversation covered the sound of approaching footsteps. Closed windows offered no protection against a powerful handgun. Interior lights made faces visible while the darkness outside concealed the person looking in. A couple might believe they were alone when someone was standing only a few yards away. After the attacks became widely connected, people shortened those conversations. Dates ended at apartment entrances rather than inside cars. Some men walked around the vehicle to open a door and examine the street while doing so. Others drove away immediately after dropping someone off rather than waiting until the person entered the building. What had once been polite or romantic now required a quick calculation. The gunman had not invented danger in New York. Residents were already accustomed to thinking about robbery, assault, and car theft. Many knew which subway stations felt less secure after dark and which blocks were best avoided. Son of Sam added a different threat because his attacks did not appear connected to money or ordinary street crime. Handing over a wallet would not satisfy him. Locking the car doors did not keep out bullets. He approached people who had no opportunity to bargain. The police attempted to give the public useful advice without making the panic worse. Patrols increased in areas associated with young couples, including quiet streets, parking areas, and places near discos. Plainclothes officers watched locations that resembled earlier attack scenes. Detectives continued comparing registered firearms, threatening letters, psychiatric histories, and reports of suspicious men. The main investigative force grew into one of the largest manhunts New York had conducted, while tip lines received calls from citizens offering names of husbands, former boyfriends, co-workers, neighbours, and strangers. At the height of public anxiety, reports described calls arriving at a rate of roughly 100 per hour. Some tips were thoughtful. A caller knew a man who owned a .44 caliber revolver and had behaved violently toward women. Another had seen a suspicious car near one of the crime scenes. A neighbour recognised lettering in the published Son of Sam message. Each possibility had to be checked. Many tips were useless. A woman angry with her former husband might decide that his temper made him capable of murder. Someone who disliked a co-worker could report that he resembled a sketch. Men with dark, curly hair found police officers or frightened citizens studying their faces. Taxi drivers, security guards, veterans, postal workers, and anyone known to own a gun could temporarily seem suspicious. The conflicting sketches made this worse. Survivors and witnesses had observed the attacker in poor light and under extreme stress. Some descriptions showed a heavy man with dark curly hair. Others suggested a thinner face. Newspapers printed images that readers compared to everyone around them. A man could match one sketch and look nothing like another. For New Yorkers who resembled the drawings, the summer created its own kind of danger. One man later remembered being mistaken for Son of Sam because his face and hair seemed similar to the widely circulated image. Ordinary people had become amateur investigators, and they did not always wait for proof before allowing suspicion to show. The city's racial and ethnic tensions also shaped the search. Most descriptions identified a white man, sometimes believed to be Italian or Jewish, operating mainly in neighbourhoods where those populations were common. In parts of the Bronx, Queens, and Brooklyn, residents studied men from their own communities. A stranger was suspicious, but so was the unmarried neighbour who kept unusual hours or the quiet man who never appeared to have a girlfriend. Berkowitz lived in Yonkers, outside the five boroughs, where the fear was just as recognisable. He could read the headlines, listen to radio reports, and observe women changing their hair because of him. He could see couples hurrying away from parked cars. The police precautions provided proof that his actions mattered. For a man who had spent much of his life feeling ignored, the sight of a city rearranging itself around his crimes appears to have been part of the reward. This did not make him powerful in any supernatural sense. He was protected by anonymity, mobility, and the difficulty of searching a metropolitan region containing millions of people. His weapon allowed him to attack quickly. His car allowed him to leave. The newspapers enlarged his image, but the man himself still had to work, shop, sleep, and maintain the appearance of an ordinary resident. Every evening offered the possibility that someone might notice him. A neighbour could remember his threats about barking dogs. A co-worker could recognise his handwriting. A police officer could stop his car for a routine violation and find the revolver. A witness could record the licence plate. Berkowitz continued not because he was untouchable, but because these small events had not yet aligned. For the public, however, every day without an arrest made him appear more capable. The June 26th attack on Judy Placido and Sal Lupo intensified the fear because the couple had left a disco where the Son of Sam case had reportedly been discussed. They had been aware of the danger and were still attacked after entering a parked car. Both survived, but the event carried an unsettling lesson. Knowing the killer existed did not guarantee that a person would recognise the moment when he approached. The attack also came close to the anniversary of the shooting of Donna Lauria and Jody Valenti. Berkowitz had referred to the anniversary in his letter to Jimmy Breslin, leading police and the public to wonder whether he planned a special act of violence around July 29th. Threats tied to a specific date create a different kind of anxiety. People count toward them. Newspapers remind readers how many days remain. Police must prepare even when they cannot know whether the date is meaningful or intended as a distraction. July arrived hot and tense. New York in 1977 was already struggling with financial decline. reduced municipal services, high crime, political conflict, and widespread doubt about the city's future. The mayoral campaign was underway. Graffiti-covered trains carried workers through neighbourhoods where abandoned buildings stood beside occupied homes. The Yankees were attracting attention in the Bronx, and disco music poured from clubs where people were determined to enjoy themselves despite everything outside. Then, on the night of July 13th, the electricity failed. Lightning strikes and a series of problems in the power system led to a blackout across most of New York City. The lights went out shortly before 10 o'clock in the evening and were not fully restored until the following night. Looting spread through several neighbourhoods. More than 1,000 fires were reported, and approximately 1,600 stores were damaged or looted. The event became another symbol of a city that seemed unable to control what was happening inside it. The blackout was not caused by Son of Sam, and Berkowitz was not known to have attacked during it. Still, the timing intensified the atmosphere around his crimes. New Yorkers who had spent months being warned about a gunman who approached in darkness now found entire neighbourhoods without streetlights. Elevators stopped. Subway service was disrupted. Apartments became hot and black. People carried flashlights and candles through stairwells while sirens moved outside. For many residents, the fear of Son of Sam became one element inside a much larger night of uncertainty. A person looking from an apartment window might see firelight, crowds, police vehicles, and stores being emptied. A family listening to a battery-powered radio could hear reports of disorder without knowing what was happening 2 blocks away. The gunman did not need to be present for people to think of him. His name had become attached to nighttime danger throughout the city. When power returned, the heat remained. Summer nights pushed people outdoors because many apartments lacked effective air conditioning. Families sat on stoops. Children played near open hydrants. Couples searched for places where they could talk privately. Staying home was not always comfortable or practical. Fear could alter behaviour, but it could not eliminate the physical realities of city life. Hair salons continued hearing requests connected to the case. Newspaper sellers continued displaying the latest headlines. Parents continued making daughters promise not to sit in cars. Police continued covering likely locations while detectives worked through an enormous accumulation of reports. The approaching anniversary placed additional pressure on the task force. Officers could not guard every couple in every parked car. They did not know whether Berkowitz would return to the Bronx, Queens, or Brooklyn, or whether he would cross into another part of the region. A large police presence in one neighbourhood might simply direct him somewhere else. If the department announced too many precautions, it risked frightening the public further. If it said too little, it would be accused of failing to warn people. Ordinary residents created their own systems. Some groups arranged that no woman would walk home alone. Friends telephoned one another after dates. Parents waited awake beside apartment windows, watching for a familiar car to turn onto the block. Fathers went downstairs to meet daughters at the curb. Young men were instructed not to remain parked after dropping someone off. People who had never before paid attention to revolver calibers now recognised the number .44 immediately. The case also entered humour, as frightening subjects often do in New York. Jokes circulated in offices, bars and schoolyards. People made nervous remarks about hair colour, or asked whether someone's date owned a bulldog revolver. The humour did not mean the fear was false. It was one of the ways residents reduced something enormous to a size they could discuss. New Yorkers were practised at this. The city's humour had always grown beside hardship. People mocked the subway while riding it, insulted the neighbourhood they would defend from any outsider, and turned public failures into stories repeated over dinner. Son of Sam became part of that language, but the jokes usually ended when someone had to walk to a car alone. The victims and survivors experienced the summer differently from everyone else. For them, the threat was not an image on a newspaper cover. Jody Valenti had been sitting beside Donna Lauria when the first publicly recognised attack occurred. Carl Denaro lived with the injuries caused by the shot to his head. Joanne Lamino had been paralysed. John Diel had watched Christine Freund collapse beside him. Families visited hospitals, attended funerals, answered reporters, and waited for the police to identify the person who had changed their lives. The public sometimes treated the case as a mystery. The victims did not have that distance. Each new report forced them to learn that the man responsible was still free. Each published letter gave him more attention. Every debate about hairstyles or psychic predictions took place around the permanent consequences of what he had done. The city feared that another attack might happen. Several families already knew what happened afterward. As July 29th approached, the date passed without the major anniversary attack many people expected. This offered only a brief sense of relief. Berkowitz did not have to obey the schedule he had suggested. He controlled when to appear, and the public had no way of knowing whether silence meant that he had stopped or was waiting. During the evening of July 30th, 20-year-old Robert Violante met 19-year-old Stacy Moskowitz for a date in Brooklyn. They ate, saw a movie, and spent time near the waterfront. It was the kind of summer evening thousands of young couples were still determined to have. The warnings had not removed their right to go out, and Stacy did not match the image that had frightened so many brunettes. Her hair was blonde. After midnight, Robert parked his car near Shore Parkway in Bath Beach. The location was beneath or near a streetlight and close to a park. The couple sat together inside the vehicle. At some point, Robert noticed a man nearby, but there was no immediate reason to know that the stranger was the person being hunted across New York. Berkowitz approached the passenger side. He raised the .44 caliber revolver and fired 4 times at close range. Bullets struck both Stacy and Robert in the head. The gunman ran toward the park and disappeared before the surrounding area could respond. Robert survived, but a bullet destroyed his left eye and severely damaged the other, leaving him with devastating injuries. Stacy was taken to the hospital and remained alive for more than a day before dying. She became the 6th person killed in the series. The attack demolished the belief that dark hair alone defined Berkowitz's victims. Stacy was blonde. She and Robert had parked beneath a light rather than hiding in a completely dark street. Public precautions had always been based on incomplete information, and the final shooting proved how little the city truly understood about the rules inside the gunman's mind. Police arrived in Bath Beach and began working the scene. Detectives interviewed witnesses, searched the park, examined the car, and asked residents what they had seen before and after the shots. Officers checked nearby vehicles and recorded details that seemed routine. In a city overwhelmed by dramatic theories, threatening letters, conflicting sketches, and thousands of telephone calls, the investigation once again depended on ordinary police work performed one address and one question at a time. Somewhere among the minor observations from that night was a fact so small that it could easily have disappeared into the paperwork. A car from Yonkers had been parked illegally near the scene, and someone had written a ticket. The city had spent a year searching for a monster. The trail toward David Berkowitz was about to begin with a piece of paper left beneath a windshield wiper. The parking summons placed beneath the windshield wiper of David Berkowitz's car looked like one more irritation in a city overflowing with paperwork. New York police officers issued tickets every night. Drivers parked beside fire hydrants, ignored signs, blocked driveways, and convinced themselves they would be gone before anyone noticed. Most summonses produced nothing more dramatic than an argument, a fine, or an envelope mailed to the city. This one would help end the largest manhunt New York had seen in years. Shortly after midnight on July 31st, 1977, Robert Violante and Stacy Moskowitz sat inside Robert's car near Shore Parkway in Bath Beach, Brooklyn. They had spent the evening together and stopped near a park before returning home. David Berkowitz approached the vehicle, raised his .44 caliber revolver, and fired through the window. Robert was struck in the head and suffered permanent damage to his sight. Stacy was also shot in the head and died at the hospital the following day. She was 19 years old. The attack occurred after more than a year of shootings, 6 deaths, severe injuries, threatening letters, conflicting descriptions, and thousands of reports from the public. The police task force had examined suspects, guns, handwriting samples, vehicles, psychiatric records, and every possible connection among the victims. Detectives had followed men through neighbourhoods, watched parked cars, questioned former boyfriends, and answered telephone calls from citizens who believed they had recognised the face from a composite sketch. None of that work had yet produced David Berkowitz. The final break did not begin with an expert studying ballistics or a detective suddenly understanding the secret meaning of a letter. It began with a neighbourhood resident named Cecilia Davis, sometimes identified in accounts as Cecilia Davis, who had gone outside with her dog near the time of the Bath Beach shooting. Davis lived close enough to the crime scene that the streets were familiar to her. During the early morning hours, she noticed a police officer writing a parking summons for a car left illegally near a fire hydrant. The vehicle was a pale or yellowish Ford, ordinary enough that it might have disappeared from memory under different circumstances. After the officer left, Davis saw a young man moving through the area. She later described his walk as unusual, and remembered that he held one arm stiffly, as though he were carrying or concealing a dark object. The man looked directly at her, and something about the encounter frightened her enough to hurry home. Minutes later she heard gunshots and the sound of a car horn. At that moment Davis did not know whether the stranger had anything to do with the shooting. A large city trains people to notice danger, but it also trains them to question their own reactions. Perhaps the man had simply walked awkwardly. Perhaps the object was harmless. Perhaps the illegally parked Ford belonged to someone visiting a friend. By the time Davis learned that another Son of Sam attack had taken place nearby, the stranger was gone and the neighbourhood had filled with police officers, reporters, and curious residents. She did not immediately give detectives the complete story. Accounts generally place her calls several days after the shooting. Fear may have contributed to the delay. Berkowitz was still free, and Davis believed he had looked directly at her. Reporting what she had seen meant admitting that the killer might have noticed her face and knew where she lived. When she finally spoke, detectives listened carefully. The unknown man mattered, but the parking officer mattered just as much. If a summons had been issued, then a written record existed. The license plate, vehicle description, date, location, and registered owner could be recovered. Instead of searching through every car in New York, investigators could search the small number that had received tickets near the crime scene during the relevant hours. The task sounded simple. It was still police work, which meant telephone calls, records, offices, and the possibility that a small administrative mistake had ruined the lead. Detectives contacted the unit responsible for the summonses and reviewed the vehicles ticketed in the neighbourhood. Among them was a 1970 Ford Galaxy registered to a man living in Yonkers. The owner's name was David Berkowitz. At first, that name did not solve anything. There was no reason to arrest every person whose car had been parked near the shooting. Brooklyn contained restaurants, apartments, parks, relatives, friends, and businesses that brought visitors from other parts of the metropolitan area. A Yonkers resident could have been visiting someone, attending a party, working nearby, or passing through. The owner might have witnessed something useful without realising it. Detectives needed to learn who Berkowitz was and why his car had been near Shore Parkway in the middle of the night. The distance immediately raised interest. Yonkers lies north of the Bronx. Bath Beach is deep in southern Brooklyn. Berkowitz had travelled across or around much of New York City to reach the neighbourhood where Stacy Moskowitz and Robert Violante were shot. The journey was possible, but it was not the kind of accidental trip most people made after midnight without a reason. Investigators checked his records. Berkowitz was 24 years old, white, unmarried, and living alone. He worked for the United States Postal Service. He had served in the army and knew how to handle firearms. His age and general appearance fit at least some of the witness descriptions. None of these details prove that he was son of Sam. Together, they made him someone worth finding. Detective James Justice of the New York Police Department contacted the Yonkers Police Department on August 9th and asked for help arranging an interview. The call produced the moment when the parking ticket lead joined a completely separate trail of complaints that had been developing around Berkowitz's home. The civilian dispatcher who received the inquiry was Wheat Carr, a daughter of Sam Carr. She recognised the name immediately. David Berkowitz was not merely a postal employee who happened to live in Yonkers. He was the disturbing neighbour who had complained obsessively about the Carr family's black Labrador retriever Harvey. The family had received threatening letters. Harvey had been shot and wounded. Other neighbours and former landlords had reported harassment, fires, or strange messages connected to Berkowitz. Yonkers investigators had already encountered his name while dealing with incidents that had seemed local and personal, rather than part of a citywide murder investigation. Then there was the name of Wheat's father, Sam Carr. The man being hunted called himself the son of Sam. A name alone can be a coincidence. Sam was hardly rare. New York police could not arrest Berkowitz because he lived near someone named Sam any more than they could arrest every man with dark hair. Yet the connection was powerful when placed beside everything else. Berkowitz's car had received a summons near the final shooting. He matched portions of the physical description. He had military firearms training. He had threatened the family of a man named Sam. He had reportedly shot their dog. The letters connected to those neighbourhood disputes could be compared with the messages sent by son of Sam. The case that had seemed too large to contain suddenly began narrowing toward one apartment building on Pine Street. This is the point where the parking ticket story is often simplified. People say that son of Sam was caught because he received a ticket, as though a detective read the summons, drove directly to Yonkers, knocked on a door and found the murderer waiting behind it. The summons was essential, but it was not enough by itself. Cassilia Davis had to remember the officer writing it. She had to overcome her fear and contact police. Detectives had to locate the record and recognise that a Yonkers car near the scene deserved attention. James Justice had to contact the correct department. The dispatcher had to recognise Berkowitz's name. Yonkers police had to connect him with the threats, the wounded dog, and the strange incident surrounding the Carr family. Each piece was incomplete alone. Together they created the first path that led directly to the man. The investigation had spent months working from the crimes toward an unknown suspect. Now officers could work from a known suspect back toward the crimes. On August 10th, detectives and Yonkers officers began watching the area around 35 Pine Street. It was a modest apartment building on a narrow residential street, not the kind of place New Yorkers had imagined when newspapers described the lair of a mysterious killer. Cars were parked close together. Houses and small apartment buildings stood within sight of one another. Neighbours came and went. Somewhere inside, Berkowitz was continuing an ordinary day while armed officers studied his car. The Ford Galaxy was parked outside. Officers examining the vehicle saw enough to increase their concern. Accounts differ about the exact position and type of every weapon visible, but investigators observed a firearm or long gun in the car and discovered ammunition, maps associated with the shooting locations, and a threatening letter intended for Deputy Inspector Timothy Dowd, who had led the Son of Sam investigation. A paper bag connected with the .44 caliber revolver was also waiting inside the vehicle. The discovery created both excitement and danger. If Berkowitz was son of Sam, police were now standing outside the home of a man who had repeatedly fired at strangers without warning. He might be carrying another weapon. He might look from a window and notice the surveillance. He might refuse to surrender, shoot at officers, take a hostage, or escape through another exit. Some accounts later claimed that he had been preparing to travel to a nightclub in the Hamptons and intended to continue killing before dying in a confrontation with police. Berkowitz himself made statements about going out in a blaze of glory. Because he repeatedly changed his explanations and enjoyed enlarging his own story, such claims must be treated carefully. What can be said with confidence is that he was armed when he came out of the building and that the officers had reason to expect violence. Police also faced legal questions. Entering his apartment without the proper authority could endanger the case they were trying to build. Arresting him too early might leave them without the evidence needed to connect him conclusively to the murders. Waiting created risk, but it allowed them to control the location and confront him away from neighbours inside the building. So they watched. For detectives who had spent months chasing sketches, rumours, and false confessions, the waiting must have felt strangely quiet. The man who had occupied front pages and frightened millions was only a few yards away, yet no one could be completely certain until he appeared. Evening settled over Yonkers. Residents returned from work. Doors opened and closed. Cars passed along Pine Street. The police tried to remain unnoticed while maintaining positions from which they could move quickly. Detective John Falotico and Detective Sergeant William Gardella were among the officers preparing to make the arrest. At approximately 10 o'clock that night, David Berkowitz came out of the building and walked toward his Ford. He did not look like the figure New York had created around the name Son of Sam. He was not wearing a costume or carrying himself like a supernatural messenger. He was a heavy-set young man with dark hair, dressed like someone leaving an apartment on an ordinary summer evening. He entered the car. The officers moved. Falotico approached from the driver's side while Gardella covered the passenger side. Guns were raised because they did not know whether Berkowitz would reach for his weapon. Inside the car, close to him, was a paper bag containing the .44 caliber Charter Arms Bulldog revolver used in the shootings. Berkowitz did not resist. The exact first words attributed to him vary according to the person telling the story. One remembered him saying, "Well, you got me." Another version adds, "How come it took you such a long time?" Still another describes him acknowledging that the trail had ended. What remained consistent was his calmness, and the strange smile officers remembered on his face. After 13 months of attacks, the arrest lasted only moments. There was no exchange of gunfire, no chase crossed the city, no hostage crisis unfolded in the building. The man who had promised continued killing allowed officers to remove him from the car and take possession of the revolver. The weapon mattered more than any dramatic statement. Ballistics could compare it with bullets and cartridge evidence collected from the shootings. The letters and objects recovered from the car could be examined. His handwriting could be placed beside the messages to Captain Borelli and Jimmy Breslin. The suspect finally had a face, an address, a workplace, and a life that detectives could investigate. News of the arrest travelled quickly through police channels. For more than a year, every report of another attack had brought frustration and dread. Now officers telephoned commanders, prosecutors, and city officials with a different message. A man had been taken into custody. A .44 caliber revolver had been recovered. The evidence strongly suggested that the search was over. Berkowitz was first taken into custody in Yonkers and then transported to the 60th Precinct in Coney Island, where the Son of Sam task force operated. The transfer brought him back toward the part of Brooklyn where his final victims had been attacked. Word spread before the police could fully control the scene. Reporters, photographers, officers, and curious residents gathered outside. New York had spent months imagining the moment Son of Sam would be caught. When it happened, the city wanted to see him. Police vehicles pushed through crowds. Camera flashes struck the windows. Reporters shouted questions that could not be answered over the noise. Officers surrounded Berkowitz as they moved him inside. The quiet postal worker from Yonkers now stood at the centre of the attention he had demanded through gunshots and letters. Mayor Abraham Beam arrived at the precinct during the early morning hours. After seeing the suspect, he announced that New Yorkers could rest more easily because police believed they had captured Son of Sam. The statement was cautious enough to respect the legal process, but clear enough to tell frightened residents that the immediate danger appeared to be over. Radios carried the news into apartments before sunrise. Television stations interrupted their schedules. Newspaper editors remade front pages. People who had spent the summer checking the street before entering a car heard the name David Berkowitz for the first time. Across the city, families telephoned one another. Parents called daughters who had changed their hair or stopped going out at night. Couples who had avoided parked cars discussed whether the arrest could be trusted. Nightclub owners, restaurant workers, taxi drivers, and police officers listened for confirmation. Some New Yorkers celebrated. Others remained cautious, remembering how many misleading developments had appeared during the investigation. For the victims' families, relief could not undo what the arrest confirmed. Donna Lauria was still dead. Christine Freund, Virginia Voskerichian, Valentina Suriani, Alexander Esau, and Stacy Moskowitz would not return because the gunman had been identified. Joanne Lamino remained paralyzed. Robert Violante's eyesight had been destroyed. Other survivors carried bullets, scars, and memories that no police announcement could remove. The manhunt had ended for the city, but the consequences of the attacks had not. Inside the precinct, detectives began questioning Berkowitz. They did not face a suspect determined to maintain his innocence. He confessed quickly to the shootings and spoke with an eagerness that disturbed some of the officers listening. The same man who had hidden his identity for months appeared relieved to have an audience that knew exactly who he was. Then he offered the explanation that would produce another wave of headlines. Berkowitz claimed that the orders to kill had come through Harvey, the black Labrador belonging to Sam Carr. The dog, he said, was controlled by demonic forces and demanded the blood of young women. Sam Carr became the Sam behind the name he had written to police. The shootings were presented as obedience to an outside power, rather than decisions made by David Berkowitz. The story sounded like the final answer to the mystery created by his letters. It explained the dog, the name, the neighborhood threats, and the references to demons. It also moved responsibility away from the man sitting in the interrogation room. Years later, Berkowitz acknowledged that the demonic dog explanation had been a hoax. His accounts continued changing, and later claims about accomplices and cults created arguments that never entirely disappeared. During the first hours after the arrest, however, investigators had to consider whether he was delusional, pretending to be delusional, or mixing genuine disturbance with a calculated attempt to shape his defense. That question would move the case out of the streets and into courtrooms, psychiatric examinations, legal arguments, and a media spectacle unlike anything the surviving victims and their families had requested. The city had found the man behind the name. It still had to decide whether David Berkowitz understood what he had done, whether he could be tried for it, and what punishment could possibly answer 13 months of fear. The arrest of David Berkowitz ended the immediate danger, but it did not end the confusion surrounding him. Police had found the revolver, obtained a confession, and connected the quiet postal worker from Yonkers to the shootings that had terrified New York. Those discoveries answered the most urgent question. The gunman was no longer free. What remained was a more difficult legal problem. Could he be held responsible in court for what he had done? Berkowitz had already begun presenting himself as someone controlled by forces outside his own mind. He claimed that a demon had spoken through Harvey, the black Labrador owned by his neighbour Sam Carr, and ordered him to kill. The explanation was dramatic enough to dominate the first reports after his arrest. It gave newspapers a simple answer to the strange name Son of Sam, and appeared to connect his letters, his hatred of barking dogs, and the threats he had sent to the Carr family. The story also offered Berkowitz a possible route away from full responsibility. A person can behave irrationally without being legally insane. That distinction is often misunderstood. The court did not need to decide whether Berkowitz was normal, emotionally healthy, or free from delusions. It needed to determine whether he understood the charges against him, could assist his lawyers, and possessed enough awareness of his actions to be tried under New York law. He was sent to the psychiatric division of Kings County Hospital, where doctors examined him. They interviewed him about his childhood, the shootings, the dog, the letters, and his understanding of the legal process. Berkowitz could describe the attacks in detail. He remembered locations, victims, movements, and the decisions he'd made before and after firing. He had concealed the weapon, changed locations, escaped from crime scenes, followed newspaper coverage, and written messages designed to mislead or provoke the police. Those actions did not resemble a man who had no understanding that murder was illegal. His lawyers still had reason to consider an insanity defense. The demon story, the strange writing, his earlier mental difficulties, and the bizarre behaviour reported by neighbours could support an argument that he was seriously disturbed. A trial built around his state of mind might have become one of the most closely watched insanity cases in American history. Berkowitz refused that approach. He told his attorneys he wanted to plead guilty. Whether this came from genuine acceptance, a desire to control the proceedings, or his enjoyment of public attention, is difficult to separate completely. He had spent months hiding from the police while making sure the city knew he existed. After his arrest, he no longer needed to conceal his name. The courtroom offered another audience. The legal process moved through 3 boroughs because the shootings had taken place in the Bronx, Queens, and Brooklyn. Prosecutors and judges had to coordinate charges involving 6 murders and 7 attempted murders. Survivors were interviewed again, families prepared to attend hearings in which the man responsible might sit only a few yards away. Reporters filled corridors waiting for the smallest development. For the public, the months after the arrest felt different from the summer manhunt. New Yorkers no longer checked every dark-haired stranger against a composite sketch. Couples returned gradually to parked cars. Women who had changed their hair could allow it to grow again. Yet Berkowitz remained in newspapers because the question had shifted from where he was to what the courts would do with him. His victims could not make the same transition. Jody Valenti had survived the attack that killed Donna Lauria. Carl Denaro had undergone surgery after being shot in the head. Donna DeMasi and Joanne Lamino carried the effects of the Queen shooting, with Joanne left paralysed. John Deal had been sitting beside Christine Freund when she was killed. Robert Violante lived with severe damage to his eyesight and the memory of Stacy Moskowitz dying after their date. A guilty plea could spare them a long trial, but it could not spare them from hearing Berkowitz speak. On May 8th, 1978, he appeared in court and admitted responsibility for the shootings. He pleaded guilty to 6 counts of second-degree murder and 7 counts of attempted second-degree murder. The plea removed the need for prosecutors to prove every attack before a jury. It also prevented Berkowitz from using a public trial to prolong the spectacle through weeks of testimony, photographs, psychiatric arguments, and cross-examination. The court still had to question him carefully. A guilty plea must be voluntary and informed. The judge asked whether he understood that he was giving up his right to a trial. Berkowitz acknowledged that he did. He answered questions about the shootings and described firing the revolver. His calmness disturbed observers because it seemed disconnected from the suffering being discussed. There was no mystery left about whether he had pulled the trigger. The mystery was why he appeared so comfortable admitting it. Sentencing was scheduled later that month. Families expected to hear the judge impose the maximum punishment available under the plea. Instead, the hearing became one more display centered on Berkowitz. As he entered the courtroom, he began making obscene and insulting remarks about Stacy Moskowitz, the final person he had killed. He chanted that she had been immoral and declared that he would kill the victims again. Robert Violante, who had been sitting beside Stacy during the shooting, shouted back. Stacy's mother reacted from the courtroom. Officers restrained Berkowitz as the hearing collapsed into anger and confusion. At one point, he reportedly attempted to reach or leap through a courtroom window. Whether he truly intended to jump or was creating another scene, the behaviour was serious enough that the judge stopped the proceedings and ordered another psychiatric examination. 3 weeks later, doctors again concluded that Berkowitz was competent to be sentenced. Consider what that delay meant for the families. They had entered the courtroom expecting a legal conclusion. Instead, They heard the killer insult a young woman he had never known, watched him direct attention back toward himself, and left without the sentence they had come to witness. Even after arrest and confession, he had found another way to force them into his performance. On June 12, 1978, David Berkowitz returned to court. This time, the proceeding continued. He received 6 consecutive sentences of 25 years to life, one for each murder. The structure of the sentence meant that even though he would eventually become legally eligible for parole, the court intended him to remain imprisoned for life. He was 25 years old. The numbers sounded enormous, but numbers did not measure what had been lost. Donna Lauria had been 18, Christine Freund was 26, Virginia Voskerichian was 19, Valentina Suriani was 18, Alexander Assor was 20, Stacy Moskowitz was 19. Their ages represented lives that had barely begun to separate from childhood. Careers, marriages, families, ordinary arguments, changing interests, and decades of experiences had been removed in moments. The sentencing could punish Berkowitz. It could not return any of that time. Outside the courtroom, another argument had already begun. Reports and rumours suggested that publishers, filmmakers, or journalists might pay large sums for Berkowitz's story. New York had watched him create a marketable identity through murder. Now there was a real possibility that the same identity could earn him money. The idea caused widespread anger. The victims' families faced medical costs, funeral expenses, lost income, and permanent injury, while the killer's account of the crimes had commercial value. New York legislators responded in 1977 by passing what became known as the Son of Sam law. It required money earned by accused or convicted criminals from books, films, interviews, or other works about their crimes to be placed under state control so victims could pursue compensation. The law revealed how completely the case had entered American language. Son of Sam was no longer only the name of one murderer. It became a legal phrase used for the principle that criminals should not profit from the attention created by their offences. Similar laws were adopted elsewhere. They appeared morally straightforward. A killer should not receive a large payment for describing a murder while the victim's family receives nothing. Yet the legal problem was more complicated. A law targeting income from speech about crime could restrict books, journalism, history, and first-person accounts that might have genuine public value. In 1991, the United States Supreme Court considered New York's original statute in a case involving payments connected to the book Wise Guy, which described the criminal life of Henry Hill and later became the basis for the film Goodfellas. The court unanimously ruled that the law violated the First Amendment because it was written too broadly and singled out income from particular kinds of speech. New York later revised its approach so that victims could pursue a wider range of a criminal's financial assets, rather than targeting only earnings from stories about the crime. Berkowitz had helped create a legal idea that outlived the original version of the law. That was one part of the shadow he left behind. The other parts were less visible and much more personal. After sentencing, he entered the New York prison system. He passed through several institutions and psychiatric facilities before being placed at Attica Correctional Facility, one of the state's best-known maximum security prisons. Attica had already become nationally infamous after the 1971 prison uprising and the violent state assault that ended it. By the time Berkowitz arrived, the institution held men convicted of serious crimes inside an environment shaped by strict control, overcrowding, fear, and its own social rules. Fame did not protect him there. Other prisoners knew exactly who he was. His crimes against young women and couples did not earn admiration. His face had appeared so often in newspapers that anonymity was impossible. In July 1979, another inmate approached Berkowitz and slashed his throat with a razor or sharp blade. The wound ran across the left side of his neck and required more than 50 stitches. Berkowitz survived and refused to identify the attacker. The injury left a long scar that remained visible in later photographs and interviews. It also demonstrated how quickly his relationship to danger had reversed. On the streets of New York, he had selected moments when victims were trapped, distracted, or unaware. Inside prison, he could become the person who did not see an attack coming. He spent periods in protective housing and was transferred among facilities. Prison life reduced his world to schedules, counts, cells, meals, work assignments, visits, and institutional rules. The man who had driven through several boroughs searching for victims now required permission to move from one part of a building to another. Years accumulated. New York changed outside. Ed Koch became mayor. Abandoned neighborhoods were rebuilt. The subway system was repaired and cleaned. Times Square changed from an area associated with adult theaters and street crime into a commercial tourist district. The city endured new crimes, political crises, epidemics, terrorist attacks, economic booms, and financial collapses. Berkowitz remained inside. During the late 1980s, he announced that he had undergone a religious conversion. He described becoming a born-again Christian after another prisoner spoke to him about forgiveness and gave him a Bible. Over time, he began rejecting the name Son of Sam and referred to himself as the Son of Hope. He worked in prison ministries, served in clerical roles, wrote religious material, and communicated with evangelical supporters outside. Whether his conversion is sincere is a question no outsider can answer with certainty. People can change in prison. They can feel remorse, adopt faith, become less violent, and understand damage they once refused to acknowledge. It is also possible for a notorious prisoner to create a new public identity using the same skills once used to create the old one. Berkowitz had already demonstrated an ability to change explanations and present himself in ways that attracted attention. His religious claims therefore produced sharply different reactions. Supporters saw a man accepting responsibility and attempting to use the remainder of his life to warn others. Critics saw another version of the same performance, with the language of demons and murder replaced by the language of redemption. Survivors and victims' relatives were not required to accept his account simply because he described himself as changed. That point is often lost when people discuss forgiveness. Forgiveness is not evidence, it is not a legal finding, and it cannot be demanded from a person who has been harmed. A prisoner may believe that God has forgiven him. The family of a murdered woman may still believe he should never speak her name again. Both positions can exist without the family being accused of lacking compassion. Berkowitz became eligible for parole in 2002. He had already said that he believed he deserved to remain imprisoned for life, and he asked that his first hearing be cancelled. New York still reviewed his status under the procedures required for prisoners serving parole-eligible life sentences. The hearings repeatedly returned public attention to the case. Every 2 years, newspapers could again print his photograph, summarise the shootings, quote his claims of remorse, and ask whether a man convicted in 1978 should ever leave prison. Parole boards consistently refused release. Their decision did not rest only on whether Berkowitz had behaved properly inside prison. Good institutional behaviour could not erase the deliberate and repeated nature of the crimes. He had crossed borough lines, selected vulnerable strangers, returned to attack again after seeing the fear he caused, and written letters promising more violence. He had not acted once during a sudden argument. The shootings required repeated decisions made over more than a year. At his 12th parole board appearance in May 2024, release was denied again. At that time, he was being held at Shawangunk Correctional Facility, a maximum security prison north of New York City. Reports in May 2026 said that he skipped his next scheduled parole appearance and continued to describe prison as the place where he expected to remain. The man who once demanded that New York notice him had grown old in custody. That fact can create an uncomfortable reaction. A photograph of Berkowitz in later life shows an elderly prisoner rather than the 24-year-old arrested beside the Ford Galaxy. Time changes the face, even when it does not change the record. Viewers who were not alive in 1977 may encounter the older man first, speaking calmly about religion in a prison library. The victims remain young in every photograph. Donna is still 18. Virginia is still 19. Stacy is still smiling in images taken before the final date in Bath Beach. The surviving victims are the people who were forced to grow older with injuries Berkowitz gave them. Robert Violante had to build a life with damaged vision. Joanne Lamino lived with paralysis. Others carried scars, pain, and memories that remained long after the newspapers stopped printing daily updates. This is why the order in which the story is remembered matters. True crime culture often begins with the killer. It studies his childhood, handwriting, apartment, weapon, fantasies, prison interviews, and changing explanations. The victims appear because they were selected by him. Their names become supporting information in the biography of the person who harmed them. The Son of Sam case demonstrates the danger of that arrangement more clearly than most. Berkowitz actively created a character for public consumption. He supplied the name, he wrote to the police and Jimmy Breslin. He filled his letters with strange phrases that invited interpretation. After arrest, he supplied the demonic dog. Later, he withdrew that story and discussed other explanations. Still later, he introduced claims involving occult groups and possible accomplices, keeping uncertainty around crimes to which he had already confessed. Investigators examined some of those later claims, particularly allegations that other people had participated in a broader group. Writers and documentary makers continued exploring discrepancies in witness descriptions and possible connections to the Carr family. No evidence produced another conviction for the shootings, and Berkowitz continued to accept responsibility for the Son of Sam murders, even while leaving parts of his story deliberately unclear. Ambiguity kept people interested. A solved case has limits. An alleged conspiracy can continue indefinitely. Every inconsistent sketch becomes proof that another shooter existed. Every strange phrase becomes a code. Every person who once knew Berkowitz becomes a possible member of a hidden group. The theories can be discussed without ever reaching the burden of proof required in a courtroom. The simpler truth remains terrible enough. One man with a revolver was able to exploit darkness, surprise, cars, and the size of New York. He did not need supernatural assistance. He did not need to possess extraordinary intelligence. He needed innocent people to be unaware of him for a few seconds and a city large enough to hide him afterward. The case changed the way New Yorkers remembered the summer of 1977. It became tied to the blackout, the financial crisis, graffiti-covered subway trains, crowded discos, newspaper wars, and the mayoral campaign. Those events were not all directly connected, but memory placed them together because they shared the same exhausted city. For people who lived through it, the phrase Son of Sam could bring back small details rather than famous headlines. A mother waiting beside a telephone, a father walking downstairs to meet his daughter's car, a salon floor covered with dark hair, a police sketch folded inside a handbag, a couple deciding not to remain parked for another minute, a newspaper vendor arranging copies before dawn. The arrest allowed those habits to relax, but it did not immediately remove them. Fear trains the body through repetition. Someone who has spent months checking the sidewalk before entering a car may continue checking after the danger is gone. The mind knows that an arrest has occurred. The body remembers the warning. The investigation also became a lesson in how major cases are actually solved. The task force used ballistics, witness interviews, handwriting comparisons, psychological theories, weapons records, surveillance, and thousands of tips. In the end, the final route to Berkowitz depended on Cecilia Davis remembering a suspicious man, a police officer issuing a routine parking summons, and detectives following that small record from Brooklyn to Yonkers. The famous monster was found through ordinary paperwork. There is a useful correction in that. Berkowitz wanted the city to believe he was mysterious. His letters presented him as something produced by demons, darkness, and forces beyond understanding. The parking ticket reduced him to what he had always been, a man driving a registered car, violating a local rule, and leaving evidence because he had not considered every person around him. New York survived him in the same way cities survive many frightening periods. Not by returning to exactly what existed before, but by carrying the memory forward while ordinary life continued. People went back to restaurants. Young couples sat in cars again. Brunettes wore their hair however they pleased. Police officers returned to other cases. The newspapers found new headlines. The victims did not become symbols simply because the city moved on. They had names before Berkowitz selected them, and their lives were larger than the final moments for which history remembers them. Donna Lauria was not born to become the first name in a murder timeline. Christine Freund was not simply a dark-haired woman in a parked car. Virginia Voskerichian was a college student walking toward home. Valentina Suriani and Alexander Esau were two young people spending time together. Stacy Moskowitz was having an ordinary summer date. David Berkowitz attempted to place all of them inside the story of Son of Sam. Remembering the case honestly means reversing that decision. It means placing the victims and survivors at the centre and reducing the killer to his proper size. He was not the voice of a demon, the servant of a supernatural dog, or a figure larger than New York. He was one man who made repeated choices, used a gun against people who had no chance to defend themselves, and discovered that fear could make his invented name famous. Nearly 50 years later, he remains behind prison walls while New York continues beyond them. The streets where the shootings occurred carry traffic, families, delivery workers, students, and people returning home after dark. Most pass without knowing exactly what happened there in 1976 or 1977. That may be the clearest measure of what the city ultimately took back from him. The darkness returned to being ordinary. A parked car became a parked car again. A woman's hair became nothing more dangerous than her own choice. And the name that once seemed to fill every street was left where it belonged, attached not to a monster from outside the human world, but to a convicted murderer who had been caught, sentenced, and removed from the city he tried to make afraid.